I didn't find out my cabin had new tenants until the moving boxes were already packed. My name is Barbara Coleman. I'm 68 years old, a widow for the last 7, and I live a very quiet life. After my husband passed, I took a portion of his life insurance and bought a modest piece of land in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I built a cabin there. It wasn't a mansion, just a solid, 2-bedroom retreat surrounded by white pines and sitting right on the edge of a cold, clear lake. It was my sanctuary, the place I went to read, watch the birds, and forget about the noise of the city. I didn't bother anyone, and I expected the same in return. That expectation shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my primary home in Ohio, pruning the hydrangeas, when my cell phone buzzed in my pocket. The caller ID showed Sarah, my daughter-in-law. Sarah rarely called me unless she needed something specific, usually a babysitter for her dogs or a contribution to some expensive group gift she was organizing. I wiped the dirt from my hands and answered. "Barbara, good news," she started, bypassing any standard greeting. "My parents finally sold their house, but their new condo won't be ready until spring. We figured it out, though. They're going to stay at your cabin in Michigan until April. It's perfect." I stood perfectly still in my garden. A cool breeze rustled the hydrangea leaves, but the chill I felt had nothing to do with the weather. She didn't ask. She didn't even phrase it as a suggestion. She delivered it as an accomplished fact, a schedule already etched in stone. Sarah. I kept my voice steady, wiping my garden shears with a rag. "The cabin is not available." A sharp sigh echoed through the speaker. "Barbara, please don't make this difficult. They have nowhere else to go, and it's just sitting there empty. We already told them it's theirs. They're driving up this weekend." She hung up before I could reply. I stared at the dead screen, realizing very quickly that words were going to be entirely useless. 30 minutes later, my son David called. David has always been a gentle boy, which was a blessing when he was 7, but a distinct disadvantage when he married a woman who viewed compromise as a personal insult. He usually called to smooth over the rough edges his wife left behind, playing the role of the reluctant peacekeeper. "Mom," he began, his tone apologetic but weary. "I know Sarah was a little blunt, but we're in a real bind here. Her parents are stressed out. David, it's my home, not a motel." He hesitated. I could hear the background noise of his office, the quiet hum of a man trapped between his mother and his wife. "It's just for the winter. You hardly go up there when it snows anyway. It would be a huge favor to us." "Sarah is driving me crazy about this. Mom, can't you just let them use it? It's the easiest solution. The easiest solution for them." That was the crux of it. My property, my sanctuary, was being offered up as a sacrificial lamb on the altar of Sarah's convenience. David wasn't asking me. He was begging me to absorb his discomfort. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. Crying is a waste of hydration, and yelling only gives people a reason to call you hysterical. I simply listened to the silence on the line. I realized that if I argued, they would just wear me down with guilt trips and endless phone calls. They assumed my boundaries were negotiable because I was an older woman living alone. They assumed I would eventually cave to keep the peace. "I understand the situation, David," I finally replied, my tone flat. "I will handle the cabin." I heard the immediate relief in his exhale. "Thanks, Mom. You're the best. I'll let Sarah know." He ended the call, entirely misunderstanding what I meant. I walked inside, washed my hands at the kitchen sink, and bypassed my gardening clothes for a sturdy pair of jeans. I didn't pack a bag for a relaxing weekend. I packed for a mission. I drove up to Michigan the next morning. The drive took a little over 6 hours, giving me plenty of time to formulate a plan. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't consult the police. In my experience, dragging authorities into family matters only creates a messy, expensive circus. If you want to protect your space, you have to control the physical reality of it. When I unlocked the front door of the cabin, the familiar scent of cedar and old books greeted me. It was fully furnished. I had a beautiful plush sofa, a heavy oak dining table, a fully stocked kitchen, and comfortable beds with thick quilts. It was the perfect, cozy winter retreat for a couple of freeloaders looking for a complimentary vacation. I spent Wednesday morning making some practical arrangements. I drove into the nearest town and rented a large U-Haul truck and a climate-controlled storage unit for the next 3 months. I also hired 2 local teenagers who were hanging outside the hardware store to help me with the heavy lifting. I paid them entirely in cash, and they were thrilled for the work. Over the next 8 hours, we stripped that cabin down to its bones. We moved the sofa, the armchairs, the dining table, the beds, the mattresses, the televisions, and every single dish, pot, and pan. We packed up the rugs, the curtains, and the lamps. We even boxed up the toilet paper and the hand soap. The boys worked hard, occasionally giving me curious glances, but they didn't ask questions. By the time I paid them and locked the storage unit in town, the sun was dipping below the tree line. I returned to the cabin that evening. I brought in a single aluminum folding chair from the shed and set it in the middle of the living room. When I cleared my throat, the sound echoed sharply off the bare wooden walls. The cozy retreat was gone. But an empty house wasn't quite enough to stop people determined to claim what wasn't theirs. People like Sarah's parents, Arthur and Helen, are resourceful when it comes to saving money. If they arrived and found the cabin empty, Sarah would likely just buy them some air mattresses and a space heater and tell them to make do. I needed to ensure the environment was fundamentally incompatible with human habitation. Thursday morning, I drove back to the hardware store. I rented an industrial drum floor sander, a heavy, loud piece of machinery used for stripping floors down to the raw wood. I also purchased 3 gallons of high-gloss polyurethane, a few thick brushes, and a heavy-duty respirator mask. Next, I went to the side of the house where the main water line entered. Winter in Michigan is unforgiving. If a house isn't heated properly, the pipes will freeze and burst, causing thousands of dollars in damage. It is entirely standard and responsible practice to winterize a cabin if you aren't going to be using it. I shut off the main water valve. I went through the house, draining the pipes, flushing the toilets until the tanks were empty, and pouring non-toxic antifreeze into the traps of the sinks and tubs. I turned off the water heater and flipped the breakers for the well pump. Then, I dragged the heavy sander into the living room. The floors in the cabin were original pine. They had a few scratches and watermarks near the door. It was technically true that they could use a fresh coat of finish. I decided there was no better time to tackle this massive, disruptive home improvement project than right now. I plugged the sander in. The machine roared to life with a deafening mechanical scream. Dust immediately began to fly, thick and choking, coating the windows and settling onto the windowsills. The place was no longer a vacation home. It was an active, hazardous construction zone. On Friday morning, I checked my phone while sitting in my folding chair, eating a granola bar for breakfast. I had a text from David, sent late the previous night. "Hey, Mom, Sarah's parents are hitting the road tomorrow morning. Should be at the cabin by 1 p.m. Saturday. Thanks again for doing this. Sarah is thrilled." I smiled at the screen. The timing was absolutely perfect. I spent all of Friday running the sander. I stripped the finish off the living room, the kitchen, and the hallway leading to the bedrooms. The fine, powdery wood dust coated my hair, my clothes, and every surface in the house. The cabin looked abandoned, a dusty shell of a building. By mid-afternoon, I swept up the worst of the debris and cracked the windows. I opened the first can of polyurethane. If you have never worked with oil-based polyurethane, you might not understand the sheer aggressive nature of the smell. It is a sharp, chemical, toxic odor that burns the nostrils and causes immediate headaches if you don't have proper ventilation. I put on my respirator mask and started painting the bare wood. I laid it on thick. The fumes quickly filled the small cabin, becoming so dense you could almost see them. I worked my way backward toward the front door, leaving a shiny, sticky, wet layer of varnish across the entire main living area. I finished just as the sun went down. I stepped out onto the porch, peeling off the respirator and taking a deep breath of the freezing, fresh Michigan air. The cabin was completely unlivable. The floors would be wet and sticky for at least 24 hours, and the fumes would linger for days. I grabbed my overnight bag from the porch, locked the front door, and drove to a small motel a few miles down the highway. I slept very well that night, waiting for Saturday. Saturday morning was bitterly cold, the sky a flat, pale gray. I checked out of my motel room and drove back to the cabin, arriving around noon. I parked my car behind the shed, out of immediate sight from the driveway. I put on my paint-splattered jeans and an old flannel shirt, poured myself a cup of black coffee from a thermos, and pulled my folding chair onto the wraparound front porch. I sat down, wrapped a blanket over my legs, and watched the driveway. At exactly 1:15 p.m., a large, overloaded SUV crunched up the gravel path. It was David's car. I watched as it shifted into park. The doors opened, and 4 people stepped out. David looked exhausted. Sarah looked triumphant, stepping out onto the gravel and stretching her arms, already eyeing the property like she owned the deed. From the back seats emerged Arthur and Helen. Arthur was stretching his back, looking at the surrounding trees with mild interest. Helen was already pointing at the flower boxes, likely deciding what she would plant come spring. They walked toward the porch. Sarah stopped when she saw me sitting there, her victorious smile faltering just a fraction. "Barbara," she said, her voice tight. "We didn't know you'd be here. It's my house." "Sarah," I replied mildly, taking a sip of my coffee. "I live here sometimes." David looked nervous. "Hey, Mom, we just brought Arthur and Helen up with their bags." He gestured to the back of the SUV, packed to the roof with suitcases and boxes. "How nice of you to drive them," I noted, not moving from my chair. Sarah marched up the steps, pulling a set of keys from her purse. It was the spare set David had kept for emergencies. "Well, let's get them moved in. It's freezing out here." She pushed past me and shoved the key into the front door lock. I didn't try to stop her. I just turned in my folding chair to watch. Sarah pushed the door open. Her triumphant expression vanished instantly. The moment the door swung open, an invisible wall of chemical fumes rolled out onto the porch. Sarah instantly coughed, throwing a hand over her nose and mouth. "Oh my God, what is that smell?" she gagged, stumbling backward a step. Arthur and Helen hurried up the stairs, peering over their daughter's shoulder into the cabin. There was no cozy living room. There was no furniture. There were no rugs, no lamps, no television. There was only an empty, echoing wooden box filled with a suffocating, toxic odor. The floors were a glaring, sticky sheet of wet polyurethane, reflecting the gray light from the windows. "What happened to the house?" Sarah demanded, her voice shrill, eyes watering from the fumes. "Where is all the furniture? Where are the beds?" I took another sip of my coffee. "Maintenance," I stated calmly. "I told David I would handle the cabin. The floors have needed refinishing for a long time. I stripped them yesterday and laid down the first coat of varnish. David stepped onto the porch, looking horrified. Mom, you can't walk on that. On that and the smell. It's toxic in there. I know. I agreed. That's why I'm sitting out here. It takes about 48 hours to dry. And then I have to do the second coat. Then another 48 hours. The fumes will probably take a week or two to fully clear out. It's quite a project. Helen, looking pale, gripped her husband's arm. Arthur, I need to use the restroom. I've been in the car for 6 hours. Go right ahead. I offered, pointing to the side door that led to the mudroom and the guest bathroom. Just don't step on the wet varnish. Arthur rushed his wife around the side of the house. Sarah stood frozen, glaring at me with a mixture of fury and disbelief. She was putting the pieces together, realizing exactly what I had done, and realizing I had done it without raising my voice once. A minute later, Arthur came storming around the side of the house, his face flushed red. There's no water, he shouted, pointing toward the mudroom. The toilets are empty. Nothing comes out of the sink, I nodded, maintaining my steady gaze. Of course there's no water. I winterized the pipes, with the floors being wet and the windows needing to stay open for ventilation. The temperature inside will drop below freezing tonight. I can't risk the pipes bursting while the house is unlivable for the next month. Sarah finally exploded. You did this on purpose. You deliberately ruined the house so my parents couldn't stay here. I looked at her, my expression completely neutral. I own this house. Sarah, I decided to do maintenance on my property. You assumed you could move your parents in without asking me, without my permission, and without a single shred of respect for my boundaries. You assumed wrong. Where are they supposed to sleep, she screamed, her hands balled into fists. We drove 6 hours. All their stuff is in the car. That sounds like a logistical problem you should have considered before promising someone else's property to your parents. I replied, I didn't yell. I didn't insult her. The facts were insulting enough on their own. David rubbed his face, looking utterly defeated. Mom, why didn't you just say no? I did say no, David. I reminded him quietly. To both of you. Neither of you listened. You thought I would just roll over if you forced the issue. I decided to show you that my no actually means something. Sarah was hyperventilating, staring at the wet, sticky floor of the empty cabin. There was no argument she could make. There was no authority she could call. She couldn't force me to turn the water on. And she certainly couldn't force her parents to sleep on a toxic, wet floor in an empty room. I reached into my flannel shirt pocket. I pulled out a folded piece of glossy paper and held it out. There is an extended stay motel about 12 miles back down the highway toward town, I said, offering the brochure to David. It's clean. They have kitchenettes. It's $75 a night. I suggest you get them checked in before it gets dark. David took the brochure mechanically. He looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps seeing, for the first time, that his mother was not just a soft, compliant old woman who existed to make his life easier. He swallowed hard. Okay, come on, Sarah, let's go. Sarah didn't move. She glared at me with absolute venom. You are incredibly selfish. I smiled, just a small, tight curve of my lips. If protecting my home makes me selfish, then I suppose I am. Have a safe drive back to Indiana. Sarah. Arthur and Helen didn't say a word to me. They looked embarrassed, thoroughly humiliated by their daughter's overreach. They quietly climbed back into the SUV. Sarah stomped down the stairs, slamming the passenger door so hard the vehicle rocked. David lingered for a second. I'm sorry. Mom, learn from it. David, I advised him softly. He nodded once, got into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I sat in my folding chair, sipping the last of my lukewarm coffee, and watched them back down the driveway. The gravel crunched, the red taillights flared, and then they were gone, swallowed by the pine trees. The silence rushed back in, filling the empty space they left behind. It was a beautiful, complete silence. I took a deep breath of the cold air, feeling a profound sense of relief. I had protected my sanctuary, and I hadn't needed a single lawyer or a raised voice to do it. 3 weeks later, the polyurethane was completely dry. The floors looked magnificent, a gleaming, golden pine that reflected the morning light beautifully. I drove back into town, hired the same 2 teenagers, and we moved all my furniture out of the storage unit and back into the cabin. We set the rugs down, positioned the heavy oak table, and put my husband's rocking chair right by the front window where it belonged. I turned the main water valve back on, flushed the antifreeze out of the lines, and made myself a fresh pot of coffee in my own kitchen. David called me later that week. He was cautious, testing the waters. He told me Sarah's parents had signed a short-term lease on an apartment near them in Indiana. He apologized again, acknowledging that they had crossed a massive line. I accepted his apology, but I also laid down the new laws of the land. I love you, David, I told him over the phone, but you no longer have a spare key to the cabin. And the financial help I was giving you for Sarah's new car payments is officially over. My money and my property are mine. If either of you ever try to assume control over them again, I will cut contact entirely. He agreed quickly. He didn't argue. The dynamic had fundamentally shifted, and we both knew it. I hung up the phone and walked out onto my wraparound porch. The lake was a sheet of gray glass, reflecting the cloudy winter sky. A loon called out from the far shore, a lonely, peaceful sound. I wasn't a victim. I wasn't a fragile widow waiting to be managed. I was the owner of this land, the keeper of my own peace. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders, smiled at the quiet woods, and went back inside my perfectly intact home.